So whether we're thinking of the Globe or of the Blackfriars, whether we're thinking of watching a production of The Tempest on film, sitting in a theater to watch production, or thinking of it in our own brains, as I've asked my students to do for their response papers, the text is our conduit to the way that The Tempest is performed and staged. This doesn't privilege page over stage, but it acknowledges the fact that the page is how we get to the stage. Now, we know some things about the ways that Shakespeare's plays were performed, as I said in the previous half lecture. We have uncovered archaeological basis for the way that the stages looked. We have primary accounts from playgoers at the time period. We also have things like stage directions, actors' recollections, that again are primary documents from the time period, and things like that. But what we see is, for most of us, based on our imagination. This would have been true of playgoers in Shakespeare's time as well, because the stage was mostly bare and there wasn't much in the way of props. People knew when they went to a play that they had to supply a lot of the scenery with their own imagination. Indeed, Shakespeare's Henry V begins with a prologue that says exactly this. You should imagine we have horses. You should imagine that one side of the stage is France and one side is England. You should imagine that where one man stands in battle, there are hundreds, right? So in this play, when the boatswain and the shipmaster come onto the stage talking about a storm, as they're about to do, enter a shipmaster and a boatswain, the audience would willingly oblige, and we have to do the same. Okay, so a tempestuous noise of thunder and lightning are heard. We can hear some things, we can see some things, and we've also got language going on. So we've got spectacle on the one hand and language on the other, and these two things together make up the storm. We make it out of the text, we make it out of things we can imagine, we see and hear. If we're at a production, we make it out of the ways the actors are interacting with one another, the weight that they give to certain lines, the tone of their voice, the way they use the stage space, etc. Some of my students have already turned in their reflections on how they would stage this first scene, and they're quite good. They have huge budgets, but they're quite good. One of my students said that they would have the ship at a different stage, like a sort of floating stage, apart from the main stage, both to represent the fact that these things happen separately, and also so that they could move pieces of the shipwreck around throughout the production. Another student said that they would go for more of an immersive experience with their theater audience. They would use fans and mist to make the storm more real for their theater goers. So what do we see? Lots of you have come up with really interesting stuff. We know that we see the shipmaster and the boatswain. The other things that we see are up to you and your interpretation of the text. One of the things that's interesting about The Tempest is that it's the last play that Shakespeare wrote. Some people think of it as sort of his farewell to the theater world. It's also the only play that Shakespeare wrote that doesn't come from an already established plot elsewhere. Prospero and Miranda and Caliban don't exist in some other text waiting to be turned into a play, the way that many other plays of Shakespeare's come from, right? They're based in stories that were already written or history that's been lived. The Tempest is a novel production. It's a novel plot. However, that doesn't mean that Shakespeare wasn't using sources. And these sources help us to see the storm, which is why I'm bringing them up. So the first of these sources is a letter written by William Strachey in July of 1610. This is the year before The Tempest was first performed. Now, it wasn't published until 1625, but I'll talk with you about that more in just a moment. It was published in this book by Samuel Purchas called Purchas as Pilgrims, and I've got the information from the British Library there, and I'll also give a link in the video description so that you can peruse this by yourselves. But for the next few slides, I'm going to read quite a bit of it to you because it's pretty interesting. You can see here that Strachey describes a most dreadful tempest and a wrack or shipwreck on Bermuda. And he also gives a description of those islands. And lots of what Strachey says in this letter comes up in the Tempest. So we have here just a section of the letter as it was published. And you'll see at the top it says terrible storm, fear of death, and swelling sea. So I've outlined in red the portion that I'm going to read from here, and you can just read along with me or just listen. So Strachey says, on Monday, the clouds gathering thick upon us, and the winds singing and whistling most unusually, which made us to cast off our pinnace, towing the same, until then astern, S's and F's. There's a thing called a long S that looks like an F, and so if I stumble over those, I apologize. Until then astern a dreadful storm, and hideous, began to blow from the northeast, which swelling and roaring, as it were by fits, some hours with more violence than others, at length did beat all light from heaven, which like an hell of darkness turned black upon us, so much more the fuller of horror, as in such cases horror and fear used to overrun the troubled, and overmastered the senses of all, which, taken up with amazement, the ears lay so sensible to the terrible cries and murmurs of the winds, and distraction of our company, as who was most armed and best prepared, was not a little shaken. So Strachey says everyone was scared, right? And so he's saying now why they're scared. For surely, as death comes not so sudden nor apparent, so he comes not so elvish and painful to men, especially even then in health and perfect habitudes of body, as at sea, who comes at no time so welcome but our frailties, so weak is the hold of hope and miserable demonstrations of danger. It makes guilty of many contrary changes and conflicts. For indeed, death is accompanied at no time, nor place, with circumstances every way so incapable of particularities of goodness and inward comforts, as at sea. For it is most true, there ariseth commonly no such unmerciful tempest, compound of so many contrary and diverse nations, but that it worketh upon the whole frame of the body, and most loathsomely affecteth the powers thereof. And the manner of the sickness it lays upon the body, being so unsufferable, gives not any mind free and quiet time to use her judgment and empire. So he says, fear of dying at sea is real. It's real and it's terrible. And so when Gonzaga says, I would fain die a dry death, right? This is exactly the kind of thing he's talking about. Like he would much rather die on land than at sea. And here I've circled that for you. The fear of death at sea, he says on the side, is more fearful than any other death. So here's the description of the actual tempest. And he talks more and more about the storm, and he says also, this does not compare this storm that we saw with anything else I'd ever seen. All that I had ever suffered, gathered together, might not hold comparison with this. And then he goes on to say, there was not a moment in which the sudden splitting or instant oversetting of the ship was not expected. And indeed, Shakespeare's characters cry, we split, we split. Here's some interesting stuff as well. You can see at the top it says there's a strange apparition that occurs. Strachey's crew, this ship went through, I think, a series of storms. And so this happened, this strange apparition happened in a lull between storms, I believe. But there's no lull between storms in the play. There's just one, Tempest, right? The Tempest. And so, however, this strange apparition, I think, also influenced Shakespeare. So let's have a look at the section I've outlined here. Upon the Thursday night, Sir George Somers, being upon the watch, had an apparition of a little round light, like a faint star, trembling and streaming along with a sparkling blaze, half the height upon the main mast, and shooting sometimes from shroud to shroud or sail to sail, tempting to settle, as it were, upon any of the four shrouds. And for 3 or 4 hours together, or rather more, half the night it kept with us, running sometimes along the main yard to the very end, and then returning. At which Sir George Somers called divers about him, and showed them the same, who observed it with much wonder and carefulness. But upon a sudden, toward the morning watch, they lost the sight of it, and knew not what way it made. And so the seamen are superstitious about it, and they think, okay, there's going to be another storm. Like, it's been calm for a minute, but it's going to get worse. This little light that shoots around and about makes me think of Ariel. It also makes me think of the light that the characters talk about in the first scene of the play. Here also, Strachey gives an account of the island itself, the Bermuda Islands, where the ship crashed. We found it to be a dangerous and dreaded island, he says, or rather islands of the Bermuda, whereof let me give you a brief description before I proceed to my narration, and that the rather because they be so terrible to all that ever touched on them, and such tempests, thunders, and other fearful objects are seen and heard about them, that they be called commonly the Devil's Islands, and are feared and avoided of all sea travelers alive, above any other place in the world. Yet it pleased our merciful God to make even this hideous and hated place both the place of our safety and the means of our deliverance. And hereby also I hope to deliver the world from a foul and general error, it being counted of most that there can be no habitation for men, but rather these islands are given over to devils and wicked spirits. He goes on to talk about the riches and wonders of the islands and the fact that they were really a quite habitable place for them. But the idea that these islands of Bermuda are taken over by devils and spirits certainly gives way to Shakespeare's depictions of Ariel and of Caliban. So I said that this letter was first written in 1610 and not published until 1625. So you might be wondering, well, why did Shakespeare get to read this letter? Well, Shakespeare's patron is pictured here, the Earl of Southampton. And the Earl of Southampton was an officer in the Virginia Company, which had stock in the voyage that has been written about here by Strachey. So the Earl of Southampton would have had this letter in his possession at some point because he needed to know sort of, how his investments were going. And it's thought that because the Earl of Southampton and Shakespeare were close, Shakespeare probably saw the letter when it was in his possession in 1610, and then wrote the Tempest based upon the letter, which no one saw else outside of the circle of the Virginia Company until 1625. The other thing that Shakespeare has going for him in the making of this storm, and the making of the Tempest in general, is the mask. And I've got a screen cap of a webpage here that I'm about to go to. You can see that they've defined the mask, right? It's an extravagant early 17th century court entertainment. And let me just go to it here. So this is from the Historic Royal Palaces website, and I will put the link to this in the video description below. So the mask began, they say, as an improvised performance at court in the 16th century. So courtiers and royals would get together and put on these productions, and they became really dazzling in the 17th century. The masks that were put on at the Stuart court were really lavish. You can see here this costume designer, Inigo Jones. He made really lavish costumes, really lavish sets, and the masks were just really gorgeous. So here's one of the costumes that Jones designed. And over here you can see the mask is a combination of opera, theater, ballet, and ball. Now, in the middle of the Tempest, we have a wedding mask, right, where lots of spirits and goddesses come and dance and bless the wedding, right? And so part of this dancing is mask, okay? There's also lots of misbehavior at masks, and here's another costume by Jones. Um, there, there's a lot of sort of scandal around masks, and for good reason. One of the most famous masks is the Mask of Blackness, created by Jones and Ben Jonson, and the Queen and her ladies appeared in blackface. This doesn't happen in the Tempest, but it's a possibility that Caliban, the person performing Caliban, is wearing some sort of darkened face. Actors used cork, blackened cork, to do this. And it was just as wrong then as it is now, and people knew it. But they did it anyhow. Here's another costume by Jones. And you can see here that the woman's breasts are visible through this gauzy fabric. This is another reason that masks were a little bit salacious. So masks are a big part of the background of the Tempests, right? And even if the stage is bare, as it is in many Shakespeare productions, as it probably was in the Globe pretty often, the qualities of mask, the dancing, the singing, amazing costumes, and also special effects may have been in play, especially for the storm scene. And especially because the first record we have of this play being performed is before King James. So it was a royal production, and so there may have been lots of stuff going on. So we have spectacle and language, and in the middle, we have the Tempest. Spectacle and language can help us conceive of the storm and what it may have looked like. Thinking about the sources that Shakespeare used and the style of theater productions at the time, the style that was burgeoning in the Mask, can help us also to think more about the way that Prospero's magic and Ariel's magic would have been conveyed to audiences, the way that the character of Caliban himself appears, and also the way that the wedding mask works out. So next lecture is going to be about Ariel and Caliban. If you have questions, again, please send them to me either here or via Instagram at HeyDrJP.